Today, I want to talk about answered prayers. What what's happened in my life? Specific examples of answered prayers in my life. I'll begin a long time ago. Shortly after I realized that God was real, that things weren't just a coincidence, that things that happened in my life led me to believe that God was real. I knelt down and prayed for a specific action. I wanted to see a certain person. She meant a lot to me, and it had been years since I'd seen her. And just to clear things up, her name was May. So I prayed to God that if it was possible, I wanted to see her. And I would quote certain verses of the Bible, where I mentioned that in his book, he says to us that if we ask, he will give it. And I wasn't being presumptuous when I was asking, but I was making it very clear that that's what I wanted. A few days later, that week actually, magazine ends up in my lap. It's an issue of the Navy that it was a special issue. It was an issue about the women. In it was an interview that she had done. It gave the ship that she was on. And so, out of curiosity, I wanted to see if the ship was in port. And I look at the import schedule, and I find that the ship is in San Diego, where I was. Not only do I know that it's in port, I know which port, or which pier it's at, I should say. And that afternoon, I went to seek her out, not knowing if she was going to be there or not. I get to the ship, and I talk to the quarterdeck. I ask for her and ask if he could call her. I didn't know if she was there or not, but I figured if she was on duty, she would be there. Turns out she was there. And after 5 years of not having seen her, there she is once again in person. Now, we'd been in a relationship. She'd been my fiance. We had our finances were tied together. And that all came crashing down when it ended. But I wanted to see her 5 years later, and there she was. My prayer was answered. I asked her if we could be friends. She didn't even speak. She just shook her head no. And so I walked away. When I got back to my place, my ship, right there by my bunk, I knelt down again. And I asked God if I could hear her voice, if she could call me. Even if it was for a moment, I would be happy. This prayer went unanswered for many years. But about 6 years ago, Charmaine had our daughter prematurely. And for some reason, I felt compelled to document the process that we were going through with my daughter and the NICU and all of that. Well, I get a phone call. It was only for a moment. But May had called me. She said, we can be friends. Even gave me an address where I could write to her. She said, if you write me here, I'll get it. And that was about it. Now, the moment I heard her voice, I remembered my prayer. And it reminded me that God was real. God was real. My prayer was answered after all these years. The very thing I asked for was real. It was done. After being reminded that God was real, Charmaine had prayed as well. Then she was troubled by something else. And she prayed that that come out one way or another. And a few days after that, it was a Friday actually, that Sabbath I was scheduled to preach. And on Friday I was doing my errands. My cell phone died early that afternoon. But since I was done with my errands, I pretty much left it alone. I was preparing for the Sabbath. Was working on my sermon. Adding some final touches to it. When all of a sudden, she confesses to me. She told me that she'd prayed and that she was surprised how quickly this all happened. You see, what happened was that the very thing that she asked to come out was something that had bothered her guilt. And she didn't know how to tell me, so she prayed about it. While my sisters were confronting her, she thought that they would have told me. And it's not that they didn't want to, it's that my phone was dead. It gave her the opportunity to confess, which she did. Things would have been different had she not confessed. You see, after she prayed, what happened was that same Friday, my brother-in-law was coming home from work. And it was bothering him as well. And he started to tell his friend about what had happened and how he should tell me. Now, he says he was holding his phone in such a way that there was no way it could have dialed out. But it dialed out, and my sister heard everything. That's why my sister confronted Charmaine about it. Charmaine told me about her prayer and how she was surprised how quickly, within 3 days, it was answered, basically. But it left me in a position where I had to forgive her, and I had to forgive him. For their betrayal. Now, as much as that hurt, that didn't hurt as much as what had happened to me previously. It wasn't the first time I was betrayed. And I always forgave. I just don't know why, but I always did. But the thing is that every time that I've prayed for something, when it was necessary for me to remember that God was real, or something that would further my belief in that He was real, those prayers were answered. I think the same thing happened with Charmaine. The reason why her prayer was answered, because I think she was sincere about coming out and telling me. We live in a sinful world, and we're not all guaranteed happiness here. But one thing's for sure. If we put ourselves in the hands of God, we can definitely be at peace.